actors who can't get married, guillotine-themed jewelry, and a day dedicated to tuna. Today on Footnoting History, it's part 2 of our French Revolution countdown. Hello, and welcome to Footnoting History. Today, we will be doing part 2 of our Top 10 Things About the French Revolution countdown with my co-host, Christine. We recorded this podcast at the same time as our first podcast on the French Revolution, so we'll dive right in with our number 5.
So, our number 5 topic for the French Revolution has to do with a topic that's near and dear to my heart, actors. As we discussed in our last podcast, the French Revolution saw a bit of a conflict between the church and the government as far as what their jurisdiction was. Well, turns out that the church had some very strict canon law regarding actors. Turns out if you were an actor, you were not allowed to marry, because being an actor was obviously something that was considered highly immoral. So even though in 1789 you had the National Assembly recognize the fact that actors deserve civil rights, the canon law still claimed that they were immoral. There was a very, very famous actor, Francois Talma, who was loved by pretty much everybody in the world, and he and his intended decided that they wanted to get married. But the church decided that there was no way they were going to post his bans or bless his marriage because he was an actor. This understandably made Talma very angry, and he went around and made several denouncements of the church in front of the National Assembly, demanding that actors should be able to have their marriages recognized by the church and blessed. Still, no matter what they tried to do, the church did not grant him what he wanted fast enough. So he had a civil marriage, but still wanted to get his marriage blessed and the children that he eventually had to become legitimized and be baptized. So, like any good actor does, he found himself a loophole and got what he wanted. The only way to get himself blessed and his marriage and his family to all be seen as accepted, he had to say that he was denouncing his job as an immoral actor. To do that would have meant giving up his livelihood, and if he was so famous, could you imagine having your favorite actor say that he had to retire so that he'd be allowed to get married? It's a little strange. But what he did was he waited until the theater that he was currently acting in took a break for Easter, and then he publicly denounced that he was done being an actor so that he could go, and he got his marriage blessed, had his children baptized, and 11 days later, when the theater picked back up after their Easter break, he somehow managed to decide that maybe not being an actor was the wrong life choice, and went right back to what he was doing in the first place.
Something tells me that he intended to do that.
I don't know. I think he might have...
To do that all along.
He might have had some...
He actually had a change of heart, and then had a re-change of heart?
He might have had a conversion experience, and then realized that maybe he wasn't so immoral as an actor after all. It was really important for him to go back to the stage. And he had a very long career, because if you read things about the theater in the early Napoleonic days, his name still comes up. There was already problems for people who were Jewish or people who were Protestant, so it may seem strange to have an actor, somebody whose job is their problem, trying to expand rights and have all of these things come under the jurisdiction of the government. But
that's one of the things, though, that the revolutionary government does whenever it takes power from the old regime, is that they change marriage law considerably, and they make it much. Well, they make it much easier for you to get divorced.
There's a time later on where they make it so that once you get divorced, you can't remarry the same person. Yeah, because during the French Revolution, when divorce became legalized, there was an influx of people who wanted to get divorced, but then later remarried the same person after they reconciled.
Oh.
So,
So divorce was just sort of a way of settling differences.
Conflict resolution, and then because it was something that they could never do. It's true though, because it's something that they could never do before.
Right. It was extremely. You almost never got a divorce. If your marriage was ended, you had to apply for an annulment, which had to be approved by the Catholic Church.
Right.
the year after Talma gets his marriage legitimated, after he gets it validated by the Catholic and blessed by the Catholic Church, is whenever the civil constitution of the clergy goes into effect, and all of these reforms, the revolutionary government starts reforming the Catholic Church. It makes it incredibly easy, or easier for people to get divorced. But then when Napoleon comes to...
Well, yeah, that's what I was going to say. Unrelated, though, to this particular topic, I always found it hysterical that later on, under Napoleon, once you get divorced, a man can remarry right away, but a woman has to wait 10 months.
Napoleon makes it much harder for... first of all, much harder for people to get divorced. Under Napoleon, it's more possible to get a divorce than it was before the French Revolution. Yeah. But actually, there are some aspects of the Napoleonic law which remained in place in France until the 20th century.
A couple of months ago, I sat down and read the Napoleonic Code. I'll never get those hours of my life back. It's interesting, though, that the same actors who weren't allowed to get married in a church and who were fighting for that sort of thing were the people who espoused the revolutionary ideals and passed those on to the people, as opposed to performing, Molière and all of the classical texts. And within that came the parallel between the French Revolution and the American Revolution. And you've probably heard the name Benjamin Franklin tossed around once in a while. And it turned out that in terms of
I don't know who that is.
I know you don't. Turns out that American representations on the French stage were mostly embodied by the image of Benjamin Franklin. He had been...
Well, he was huge in France whenever he came over as part of the embassy to try and convince the French to enter into the revolution on the side of the Americans.
Absolutely.
They made him commemorative plates. All sorts of stuff with his name on it or his image on it.
Exactly. So he was viewed as the embodiment of the person who had thrown off the shackles of the monarchy. Other Americans came into it too. You would occasionally have, your George Washington or your unnamed American person who was just supposed to symbolize that. But Benjamin Franklin was by far France's favorite American. He was the number one American character in French plays.
There was one in 1791 called The Printer, or Franklin's Party.
It wasn't a burst of it. It was 6 solid years from 1790 to 1796 where you saw the majority of Americans in plays. Now, once the French Revolution ended, there was less need to teach the people about these ideals, so it started to fade a little bit. But you see the height of the French Revolution coincides with the height of appearances of Benjamin Franklin in various plays in all of the little stages throughout France in general. Hey, Nathan.
Yeah, Christine?
Hey, Christine. Whatever happened to the children of Marie Antoinette and the king?
That brings us to number 4 on our top 10 countdown.
What happened? It's something like, it's 1794. Do you know where your children are?
Well, it's more like 1795, and
okay,
actually, if it were 1794, do you know where your children are? Well, it doesn't really matter because Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI were dead.
Well, that was kind of the point.
This is actually really this is a sad one, because in June of 1789, the Dauphin, the crown prince and heir to the French throne, dies, Louis Joseph. And Louis Joseph is 7, and he dies in June of 1789. And at that point, his younger brother, Louis Charles, becomes the Dauphin, becomes the heir to the throne. He is 4 whenever the revolution begins. Whenever everything sort of goes south for his family and Louis and Marie Antoinette are thrown in jail, eventually Louis XVI is separated from his family. He's put on trial. He's beheaded in January of 1793. Marie Antoinette will eventually be beheaded in October of that year.
But I have a question.
Yeah.
Was there a real fear of a rise up in support of the Dauphin?
Yes, because after Louis XVI is beheaded, the royalists which remain in France declare that his son, Louis Charles, is now Louis XVII. Right, so in their eyes, in the eyes of the royalists, Louis Charles is now the king of France. Louis, he's extremely problematic. At the same time, he's a child. He's born in 1785. The revolution begins in 1789. He's 4 when the revolution begins. His family is imprisoned in 1792, and so that would make him, 7? He's taken from his mother in July of 1793 and put in the care of a cobbler named Antoine Simon and his wife, and kept in this prison with them. There are all sorts of stories. We don't have a lot of hard evidence for what happened to the Dauphin during his time in the prison.
Which prison was he in? Do we know?
Temple Tower.
Because there were so many prisons.
Right. Well, there's all sorts of propaganda that's put out about the way that he was treated. He was, that the soldiers in the prison force-fed him alcohol and forced him to sing the Marseillaise, and that he was just generally very cruelly treated. We do know that he is coerced into accusing his mother and his aunt of sexual molestation, because these are among the charges that are levied against Marie Antoinette at her treason trial. Ultimately, he contracts scrofula, which could have been brought about by the poor conditions in the prison. The conditions under which Marie Antoinette is kept initially aren't that bad, but he is mistreated and eventually becomes sick and dies of scrofula.
At what age?
He dies in 1795 at the age of 10.
Aww.
Well, for a long time, it wasn't clear if this was actually the prince that had died, because it was, terribly convenient for the revolutionary government, even after the fall of Robespierre and the Thermidorian reaction and the end of the Reign of Terror. It doesn't do them any good to have the crown prince sort of sitting around.
No, of course not.
On top of all of that, shortly before he dies, his doctor dies. And so there's a question of whether or not, and he's assigned new doctors. And these are the doctors that are making the identification and performing the autopsy after his death. After he dies, his body is thrown into an unmarked grave. The question is whether or not this is actually the prince, because much as was the case with the Princess Anastasia after the Russian Revolution and the massacre of the Romanov family, there will be at least 3 people over the course of the 19th century. The most famous one is named Naundorf, will claim to be the lost Dauphin, just like people claim to be the Princess Anastasia. However, the heart of the body was preserved and eventually surfaces. They do DNA testing on it in the year 2000, and by comparing it with results from relatives, they determined that this is the heart within a certain percentage points genetic match of Louis Charles. And he's given a formal burial in 2004, where he's buried in Saint-Denis next to his parents.
I've never been there.
Saint-Denis? It's very pretty, but they charge you an exorbitant amount of money to get in to see the back half of the church.
Oh, sure. They all do that type of thing.
Well, and that's the other thing. That's the other thing is that Saint-Denis is, of course, the traditional burial place of a large number of the French monarchy. And during the Revolution, a lot of those graves are desecrated, and their bones were dug up. Right. And if you go to Saint-Denis today, they have sort of this plaque saying, this is everybody who is buried here, but we've only recovered,
We don't know where they are.
Well, we don't know who they are, or the bones were all thrown together, and they're somewhere in the pile behind this wall. And so the graves are sort of unmarked. Definitely none of the bodies are still in the tombs, or I don't think a significant number of them are in the tombs. So if you go and you're seeing so and so's sepulcher, they're not inside of it. They're behind a wall somewhere.
But sometimes that's all. You have to settle for what you can get.
Right. Now I also want to say a little bit about the daughter, Marie-Thérèse Charlotte. She will actually be the only member of the royal family to survive the French Revolution. After her brother, the Dauphin, Louis Charles, is taken away, she is allowed to stay with her mother for 1 more month until her mother is taken away from Temple Tower prison and placed in the conciergerie. She remains with her aunt for 1 more month, and then her aunt is taken away. She is kept in Temple along with her brother, but was, of course, kept separate from him. She is told nothing of the fate of any of her family until the summer of 1795, by which point all of her family, her father, her mother, her aunt, and her brother were all dead. And in fact, her mother and aunt had been executed 2 years previously, and she had never been told. Her brother had just died a couple of months before. She was finally set free in 1795 and fled to Austria. Of course, remember, Marie Antoinette is Austrian. This is where her family is. And she's actually able to, in Austria, reconnect with her uncle, Louis XVI's younger brother. And he arranges a marriage between Maria Therese Charlotte and his son, so she married her cousin. For the rest of the Revolution and through the Napoleonic era, she will remain in exile and will sort of wander around the courts of Europe. They spend some time in Austria, some time in Eastern Europe. They will eventually end up in England, and they are finally able to return to France after the abdication of Napoleon in 1814, at which point the Bourbon monarchy is restored and her uncle becomes officially Louis XVIII. Eventually, though, in 1830, the Bourbon monarchy is once again forced out of France. She and her husband are both made to sign a document formally abdicating any claim to the throne of France. And she's once again forced to sort of wander the courts of Europe. She spends some time in Edinburgh and in Prague. Eventually her husband dies of pneumonia, and she herself will sort of retire to Austria and will eventually die at the age of 72. So yeah, it's kind of sad. It's a kind of sad story, but
the real question is, who killed the doctor?
Yeah, it's
right?
He dies under sort of mysterious circumstances, and I mean, none of this is investigated whenever the Bourbon monarchy is restored to power, because
no. Why would you? You can't do that.
Right. So I guess that brings us to, on a happier note, our number 3 entry on our top 10 list. And that has to do with the
but nonetheless confusing.
The revolutionary calendar. Because whenever the revolution, the revolutionary government comes into power, as we said before, one of the things that they're trying to do is undo the power of the Catholic Church. And one of the most radical ways in which they set about to completely reorder people's thinking has to do with fixing the calendar. Really, it's screwing up the calendar. The revolutionary government decides that because so much of French culture revolves around sacred time, you have in the Christian faith, and particularly the Catholic faith, you have certain seasons. You have the season of Lent, which we've just come out of.
And the sporadic saints' days.
And sporadic saints' days and high holy days like Easter and Christmas. Mm-hmm. And these holidays are all centered around the Catholic faith. Well, if we continue to honor these holidays as public holidays, as we talked about last time with the Cult of Reason, that sort of defeats the purpose of getting out from underneath the umbrella or the oversight of the Catholic Church. So they decide to drastically redraw the entire calendar. Under this new calendar, each day is divided into 10 hours, and it's very mathematically precise. This is also the same revolutionary government which will eventually convert to the metric system, and everything is about being scientific, right? So each day is divided into 10 hours, each hour is divided into 100 minutes, each minute is divided into 100 seconds, which is very, very confusing. Then each week is divided into 10 days. Each month then becomes 3 weeks, or 30 days. And then we completely redraw
They didn't call them weeks, though. They didn't call them weeks.
No, they called them
decades.
They were decades. The other thing is that they have to then rename the days of the week. So instead of lundi, mardi, mercredi, jeudi, vendredi, samedi, dimanche, you have primidi, duidi, tridi, quartidi, quintidi, sextidi, septidi, octidi, nonidi, and decadi. So
first day,
second day, third day, fourth day, fifth day.
Onward. Sounds a bit like a high school schedule.
Yeah, it's soulless. It's soulless is what it is. So the months are named after largely sort of weather and agriculture, like what's happening agriculturally and what's happening with the weather then.
I think that the most interesting thing to think about in terms of adopting a new calendar like this is how confusing it was for people who were not French. I mean, you think it was confusing to be living in France and trying to deal with adapting to an entirely new way of approaching your days, but imagine any type of international commerce.
Oh, right. Well, because
you had to remain fluent in the old calendar, even though it wasn't your calendar anymore.
Exactly. If you're just across the English Channel, for instance, and you're trying to arrange you're corresponding with someone in Paris, for example. You want to set up a meeting on, say, the 19th of August. In your calendar, that's 19th of August. In the revolutionary calendar, that's the second day of Fructidor. And as I said before, they're named after either weather or something happening agriculturally. So as I said, August is Fructidor, so it's the month of fruits. But this actually goes from the 18th of August to the 16th of September. The month immediately preceding it is Thermidor, which is heat. You also have months that are named after rain, after wind, after snow.
I suppose the best way to explain it would be to say, if you were doing the conversion, it's somewhat like going by what we would consider to be the zodiac, where their months don't correspond with ours exactly. They end up incorporating halves of pretty much each month and putting them together.
Right. Each revolutionary month begins on somewhere between the 19th to the 20th, 19th, 20th of our months in the Gregorian calendar. On top of all of that, in the Roman Catholic calendar, each day has a patron saint, whose saint's day is that day, right?
Saint Dominic is August 8th.
August 8th is Dominic?
Yeah.
Mine is...
You're welcome for that factoid.
Mine is the Feast of Mary. Mine is the Feast of Mary Magdalene.
Ooh.
Yeah. But every day has its patron saint. Well, the way that the revolutionary government undoes this is that every single day in the calendar is now devoted to a thing, right? So instead of being born on the Feast of Mary Magdalene, I'm now born on a day devoted to ryegrass.
That's interesting. Do you really like ryegrass?
I can't say that I've ever actually had ryegrass, so...
I think you're missing out.
Well, you were born on a day dedicated to thistle.
Yeah, okay, but that's all right. Thistle.
Yeah.
That's just interesting to me. I wouldn't think of thistle. You say August 8th, I think St. Dominic. I don't really think thistle.
Oh.
But I'm okay with that. It's interesting.
And there are days devoted to everything. There's a day devoted to watering cans. There's a day devoted to lemons, to trout, to tuna.
When you hit watering cans, you know you're getting desperate.
Yeah, there's a day devoted to radishes, to bees, to poplar trees. They have a day dedicated to vats.
Vats?
Vats.
Like big empty things that you put things into?
Yeah. Also a day dedicated to grub hose.
I guess that's just the way of tying in man and nature.
Well, this is an agricultural economy. So it's still proto-industrial. So,
Right.
Well, and then that also brings about some really odd naming traditions as well.
Of naming people.
Yes.
I mean, during the French Revolution, you went from a time of naming children after saints to trying to name them after things that made you seem patriotic. So as much as during the French Revolution, you might have been still around a bunch of Antoinettes and Jean-Louis, as children who were born during that time period grew up, you started to find children named things like Liberté, or one I read was named the 5th of August, or you could name your child Fructidor. There were even several children that I read about whose name was Constitution.
Oy.
So you see a large change, and eventually this will go away and give way to an influx of names that are about the Greeks and the Romans when you get into the Napoleonic time, and that's what they were obsessed with then, was going back to the ancient times. But during the French Revolution, you have that all these children who are growing up with names pertaining to the ideals of the revolution, not so much the people. You don't hear as often, a child who's now going to be named Robespierre. That's not. I mean, I'm sure it existed.
Right.
It's one of those. It's the political equivalent of fad celebrity naming today. Right? It is, though.
I don't know.
I mean,
which is worse, naming your child Fructidor or naming your child, Mowgli Bronx.
Well, yeah, that's the thing. You don't think of that.
Pilot Inspector.
When somebody says, how many Marie Claires can you have in your life? You gotta have a little bit of a Fructidor coming in there and shaking it up.
And speaking of revolutionary culture, that brings us to the number 2 on our list, which is dancing.
If the early revolution was characterized by women discovering all these cafes that were popping up all over the place, the end of the revolution and the beginning of the Directory, which was a period that I kind of think is a black hole of sorts. It was when France was post-terror, but before the rise of Napoleon. So a lot of classes will kind of brush over this area because it was very confusing for a lot of people.
The Directory is most commonly accused of gross mismanagement of the French state, which is what allows Napoleon to come to power. They're supposed to solve all of the economic problems, and they don't get resolved.
During that time, people were a little less scared of being guillotined, so dancing became a big deal. But you didn't want to throw a party or to do anything that made you look too wealthy,
right?
Because you didn't want to be hearkening back to the time before the revolution and make yourself look really bad. So instead of that, people needed to find entertainment. So what happened was dance halls popped up. Dance halls were everywhere. You could find dance halls any place you wanted to go, and some of them were even advertised as having admission fees that were so low servants could attend.
Wow.
But it meant that the people who attended were of all different classes, and they would mingle together. Now, there were some that catered more to upper classes or more to lower classes and things like that, but the majority of it was a time where you saw people get together, and even though the economy was terrible, dance instructors and musicians were doing crazy business because anybody who could squeak something out on an instrument was being hired to play at these dance halls, and anybody who could do a little bit of a country dance was being hired to teach people so they could impress others when they went to their parties. But there were some people who didn't like this because not everyone ran away from France when the revolution started. You still had people who were living in Paris who supported the monarchy. And most of these people had lost members of their family to the guillotine. And as a result, they were pretty much scarred and didn't really want to take part in all this. So, although we can't know exactly how prevalent these events were, there were things called victim parties that were where supposedly you had to show up at some former monarchist's house and prove that someone in your family had died in the revolution. You would wear a red ribbon tied around your neck to show your symbolism as having been a victim of it.
And this shows that the culture post the terror, or after the most violent period of the revolution, is still incredibly polarized.
And you think about it too, actually this does segue us into our number one thing, which is something that a lot of people will be interested in, which is fashion and the French Revolution. It was not unheard of for women to crop their hair. The idea, wigs were not worn as much, but they would crop their hair shorter, and that was said to be the parallel between that and being guillotined. But you also saw a lot of changes in things like there was a whole section of time where Republican people would wear jewelry that contained fragments of the destroyed Bastille. That was a big thing. It would be in your earring or in your necklace. You know what else? You know what else people used to wear during the French Revolution?
Fans?
Well, no, but we can talk about fans because fans are interesting. Before the Revolution, a lot of them were made of tortoiseshell or mother of pearl and ivory, and they would have pictures of them on them of mythology or pastorals, like a field or maybe a castle. But then once you get into the French Revolution, it changed. There would be wooden fans with sheets of paper on them instead of fabric that would show things like your political affiliation. There were a good number of fans that had drawings on them of different moments in French Revolutionary history, whether it was a figurative picture of like liberty or maybe the tennis court oath. But in terms of jewelry, what I was going to say was, no, they wore little blades to look like guillotine if you were a diehard supporter. You can laugh.
No, there is a sense in which it's very much like wearing a cross around your neck.
Oh, absolutely. You had parents who would dress their children up like little mini National Guardsmen. They did.
Well, and I mean, they adopted the tricolor all over the place.
Oh,
they made hats out of it. They made outfits out of it. They made pins out of it. Everything in France became suddenly red, white, and blue.
Absolutely.
The other thing is that the your pants became a symbol of your political affiliation because knee breeches, which were known as culottes, were usually made of silk, and they were the purview of the bourgeoisie, the upper middle class. who were sort of the more moderate left center in the French Revolution. The really radical workers, though, did not have culottes. They didn't have the knee breeches. I mean, we're used to seeing these pictures of, people with like pants that come to your knees and then it socks all the way down. That's a culotte. If you're a common man, though, you wear pants. You wear pants that go all the way to your ankles. And so the fact that you wear these pants, these full ankle-length pants, is a symbol of the fact that you're a member of the working class and therefore a radical left-wing partisan in the French Revolution.
Definitely. You had forefront changing in men's fashion. Women's fashion changed all the time. I mean, women's fashion was constantly changing no matter what was happening, but men's fashion, it tended to vary on a theme. So to have what we would consider to be a normal trouser pant start to become popular was really a pretty big change. But all of this, it's funny because, look at this, and all of it is going to change in a few years anyway, because Napoleon's going to come around, and all of a sudden they're going to be wearing high-waisted dresses with free-flowing, gauzy white gowns.
The empire waist.
Yeah, women's fashion doesn't really stop. Men's doesn't stop either. It just seems to progress a little slower, but I could be wrong on that. That's just the way it looks to me when I look at the pictures.
This has been Footnoting History. If you liked our podcast, be sure to check us out on the web at footnotinghistory.com, like us on our Facebook page, and follow us on Twitter at HistoryFootnote. Tune in next week when we'll be talking about the Dutch tulip buying craze of the 1630s. Until then, remember, the best stories are always in the footnotes. See you next week.